Can y'all hear me without the mic? I thought so. Let's see. How are we going to get started? This is me. This is the obligatory, I have some idea of what I'm talking about slide. So I won't linger on it. I've bounced around from nonprofit to public education. And I really have always been interested in youth. I started my career as a high school teacher. I then went into public housing and worked with youth and community in public housing. And so I've always really been interested in kind of youth, and we didn't have the term back in the early 90s of opportunity youth, but I realized that that's what I was interested in, and in particular, those youth who had some challenges and how do we overcome those challenges, and that's what's guided my career largely. Anita mentioned that after 20-something years working in the Charlotte area in Greensboro, where I live now, I moved to Chicago and I had a couple of roles in Chicago. The most recent one in Chicago was as Thrive Chicago. Thrive Chicago is a collective impact organization, as mentioned. I'm going to start now by reading a letter, okay, from our board of directors. And know that, I know I've got 30 minutes. I'm holding this because I'm keeping my time, and I'll try not to put you back to sleep. So a letter from the Thrive Chicago board of directors. And I think this is it's from May of 2023. To our partners, it's with heavy hearts that we are announcing the official closure of Thrive Chicago. After 10 years of working with you to drive systems change and improve outcomes for all of our city's youth, and youth of color in particular, the time has come for Thrive Chicago to close its doors. May 12th, 2023 will be the last day for Thrive Chicago staff. Regrettably, the financial, and then they list some of their achievements over the 10 years. Regrettably, the financial instability of the past few years has required us to discontinue operations. We hope this will create more opportunities for grassroots community organizations led by directly impacted people to receive funding for their efforts to advance equity for youth of color. We want to thank the thousands of staff members, partners, and participants that have positively impacted Thrive Chicago, and by extension, the city of Chicago. It has been a great honor to work alongside you. With hope and gratitude, the board of Thrive Chicago. So I started as CEO of Thrive Chicago in December of 2022. This letter dated in May 2023 is not because I'm a bad leader. I didn't drive this organization into the ground in 6 months. What happened is what I discovered is seeds along the way that were planted over a 10-year period that led to the lack of sustainability of this organization and this effort. So my goal is to share a little bit, and this is perhaps I am getting older, the 20, 30, however long it's been, year career that I have, this is perhaps one of the greatest learning experiences. And I'm actually incredibly thankful for that opportunity to work at Thrive Chicago, even though my role became one to guide the organization to dissolution. And I realized that that was the right thing. So how do you stop yourself from getting there? I'm going to talk about some of the challenges today that you might face. But I don't want to just talk about challenges. I want to talk about process. I want to talk a little bit about at least one potential solution. So I'm going to come back to Thrive Chicago as we talk. But I also don't want to set myself up as kind of a sole expert in the challenges of collective impact. You're all collective impact leaders. You know what the challenges are as well as I do, so let's start there. Anyone, maybe just popcorn, 3 to 5, if you in your mind, and take a minute to think about it, what's the greatest challenge to your work or challenge of doing the work? If 3 people would be willing to share, just a word or a phrase, right here.
Social disparities.
Social disparities, thank you. Anyone else?
Financial resources.
Financial resources. Sustainability, which is connected to financial resources. Got a day job, right? So how do you get human resources, people, human capital, one more. Anyone, a challenge? Transition. Say a little bit more about that so I understand.
Leadership transition, relationship transitions, cultural transitions, political transitions.
People are always moving, right? People are always moving. Resources are always moving, transitions. So here's my list. It's the same list. You can go anywhere. It's going to end up being the same list. I'll talk through it in a little bit, just to tell you how I think of these things. And then we'll talk a little bit about, like, what's at the root of these things? Like, what's the common theme that can tie these things together? And so, who's on board, right? Transitions, human capital, I got a day job. Are these the right people in the room? Like, these are questions that are constantly coming up. If we're talking about collective impact, we're talking about a collaborative effort of a diverse array of stakeholders. Look around this room. And sometimes I say diverse and people immediately equate it with race. Diversity includes race, but it's not race exclusive to race, right? It's race, it's gender, it's sexual orientation, it's geography, where in the state you live. It's socioeconomic status, it's worldview, what's your religion, what's your way of thinking, right? And so just imagine the fact that every one of us in here has a different way of thinking. And then you try and bring folks together and say, okay, now we have to align on these goals. Now you're gonna have people in there who are directly resistant to the goals. Or who are, in some ways, you might find someone who's combative or feels like they're combative. The work of collective impact is to overcome this challenge, is to find what is at the root that could tie together hundreds, in some cases, thousands of people that have these diverse ideas and thinking. Incredibly difficult thing to do. If you can imagine, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country. Racially segregated, economically segregated. And we gotta find a way to talk across these differences. Cultural competence is incredibly important. And at Thrive Chicago, I discovered an organization that lacked cultural competence. So if you don't do something now to build your cultural competence, to be able to communicate across difference, then in 10 years you'll find yourself in a position to say, like, we can't keep these stakeholders engaged, which brings me to my second point. Is collaboration a real thing? I remember I used to work for the United Way in Charlotte, right? And so I was responsible for the United Way, a funder, bringing together our 90-something member organizations to say, how are we gonna collaborate? And one executive director pulled me aside and said, look, we're actually competing for the money that you're giving. So for you to say collaboration without acknowledging the fact that there is competition in this room is not fair. I said, you're right. Collaboration can and is a real thing. But we cannot move forward and say, hey, we're collaborating without first making sure the right folks are on board, meaning it's a diverse group of stakeholders, and having some shared understanding of the work like I talked about. The other thing is we have to acknowledge the competition. Like if you and I are in the same community, and there's limited grant resources, Marcus, I can't come to you and be like, hey, we're collaborating, but I hope you don't apply for that grant. It's just real. There's a real pressure to fundraise, and that can interfere with collaboration. So there is a sweet spot on it. There's a sweet spot, and it starts with transparency. You have to communicate transparently. So we talked about cultural competence, and we talked about transparent communication. It's the kids, ultimately, right? One thing you learn as an educator is like you have to be student-focused, student-centered. You gotta be kid-focused, kid-centered. And you gotta know that, I'm 48. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I got kids who are 28, 29, started young. They grew up in the 90s, early 2000s. To grow up in the 2020s, it ain't the same. And to be honest, there's only a limited amount of context that I, as a 48-year-old, can even bring to it to understand the challenges that they have. Now, I'm trained as a social scientist. That's the PhD piece, right? So I can look at the data. I can understand the data very well. But the lived experience of someone who is 16 years old in 2023, who's experiencing poverty and other types of marginalization in many cases, marginalization being pushed to the side by society because of their identities, because of who they are. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be bullied on Instagram. I can't know. And so we have to have a sincere heart to listen, to understand not our own experience and evaluate our work through our own experience, but we have to evaluate our experience through the lens of the youth that we serve. And part of what's happening with our youth is race. And I am not going to go anywhere and talk and not talk about race. You might say, well, that's probably because you're African American. And no, it's because I'm a social scientist. And because year after year of analyzing data, you look and you put in statistical controls for socioeconomic status, you put in statistical controls for geography, and race still has an impact. So don't tell me I'm colorblind. You can be colorblind, but the data say that a kid with brown skin is going to have detrimental impacts relative to a kid with lighter skin. So there's something operating there. And you can only draw one of two conclusions. One, there's a deficit in the kids. There's something wrong with those kids, which is the conclusion our country has drawn from the beginning. I offer an alternative. There is something operating in our systems and institutions that create these differences in outcomes. Social differences. Now, it's not to say that the same isn't true of rural versus urban. There's something operating there. It's not to say that the same isn't true of socioeconomic status or sexual orientation. There are differences operating there. The thing I want to drive home is that race is such a powerful predictor of outcomes. My dissertation is on the academic achievement of African American children. When controlled for everything else, race is a powerful predictor. So if we don't address what's happening in systems and institutions that are negatively impacting our kids based on race, then we can do all the work in the world. At Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools, I saw 4 superintendents. One of them, only over a relatively short period of time that I was there. One of them, the most successful one, said, look at the data. If we don't have interventions for our lowest performing kids, which disproportionately are youth of color, then we can't raise the district scores. We have to have specific interventions for those kids. And it's not about preferential treatment. It's about equity. And that's what equity is. Equity designs specific interventions to meet the needs of specific groups of kids. Race matters. The data. I've talked about this a little bit already. Just checking on time here. I'm about halfway through. I want to leave time for questions. The data. This is so hard for collective impact. Because we can look at, you've seen data from the demographers, right? That show you where opportunity youth are and But if you're thinking about your local community, you could look at test scores and other things, but what I talked about in terms of their real experience, it's so hard to find data. And so what I'm saying is the data, yes, we need quantitative data. We need numbers to track our progress, no doubt. I am data-driven decision-making, like that's at my core, social sciences. And we have to have some qualitative understanding of the experience. Evaluators might talk about it as process evaluation, right? But what I'm really talking about is knowing the kids, knowing our young people and their experience, and the only way to do that is through data collection. It could be observation, it could be interviews, it could be focus groups, and you have to understand it. The other thing I'll say about data, and then I'll move on because I want to reserve this time, is that at the more local level, it's easier to get these statewide numbers. At the more local level in your region, you have to find what are those 2 or 3 data points that we can move and look at once a quarter, once every 3 months. What data do we have in front of us, even if it's qualitative? And sure, you'll have stuff that you look at year over year, but if you wait till the end of the year to look at data, we refer to that as an autopsy. It's over. There's nothing you can do to intervene. You need formative assessment. You need something at least once a quarter that's going to change what you're doing or inform what you're doing. But it's hard, I understand. And then finally, the no-brainer, it was mentioned, funding. And it's a catch. It's the competition piece. It's the, do we want to take money for this person? Do they match our values? When I got to Thrive Chicago, we had no private donors other than some of the board members. No one was writing checks to Thrive Chicago. And our whole strategy, which I asked about in the interview, but they didn't tell. Our whole strategy for fundraising was applying for unsolicited grants. So I see some people's facial expressions that no, that's not going to sustain you long term. You have to have financial supporters that are consistent. Now, for some of you, that might end up being your government, your locality, your county, your city, your town, the state. If you can get written into a county budget, a state budget, ideally. So who's on board and why? Start talking to government officials who control the funding. They have to be a part of it. You have to talk to rich people. It can be difficult. I didn't grow up rich. I feel some kind of way when there's a guy next to me that makes $100 million a year. It makes me real uncomfortable for some reason. I'm kind of judging the person usually. We got to get comfortable identifying where power and resources are and reaching out to that power, reaching out to those resources. The only way to change systems is to change where the money in the systems are, where the investment in the systems are. Now, if you're like me, you can't go home and scroll through your phone and find a couple billion. I understand that. Neither can I. So start the conversations. And maybe you find a Blue Cross Blue Shield that becomes an angel investor. Maybe you find sense. Maintain that relationship. And ultimately, you need wealthy donors, you need less wealthy private donors who support you over time. You need grants and you need government money. It has to be braided together, the funding. Don't be dependent on a single source. I believe this about my own life. Don't be dependent on a single source of income. Diversify your investment, right? That's just a finance principle. And it has to apply. Okay, so I spent all this time talking about challenges. I got 10 minutes left. I'm going to save 5 for questions. All right. I got one solution for you, and it doesn't really fix anything. I was just supposed to talk about challenges, so the pressure's off. But I do think it is a prerequisite to accomplishing other things. And that is values. And what do I mean by values? Values are deeply held beliefs. And these deeply held beliefs can be conscious, like I know exactly what I believe about something, or they can be unconscious. We all have them, and they come from how we're socialized. They come from our families we grew up with, or the household we grew up in, and what they said to you as a kid. They come from our institutions of faith and our faith experiences. They come from what we watched on television and movies, right? And so there are these values that we all carry. The challenge is, going back to the idea of diversity and who's in the room, most of us, we might have some shared values, but most of us have a difference in values. And people think when I'm talking about values that sometimes I'm talking about morality, like you should or should not do that. That's a small subset of it. But what I'm talking about is these deeply held beliefs about what can our kids accomplish, is an example. What do you really believe our kids can accomplish? That's a value, what you think there. What do you really believe about that? What do you really believe about the value of the work? Is this something that is you're willing to die for? Is it something you're willing to live a portion of your life for? Is this just a job? And I'm not judging you either way, but it talks about your values. What's important to you and your family? Is financial success your primary motive? Or is there something else that's motivating you individually and professionally? These are values. And why do they matter? They matter because you're going to bring hundreds and sometimes thousands of people together, and sometimes those values are competing. So you have to find what are the central things that we can agree on, and you have to be explicit about it. We gotta go ahead and just name it. Sometimes we call it group norms, right? And we use operating norms for a meeting, but we need operating norms to say these are our values. So here's an example. Who gets to make the decisions in your organization or your collective? Is it one person? Is it a small group of people? Why do they get to make those decisions? It could be a collective that makes the decision. But how do they make the decision and why? And does everybody agree on that? Because if not, it becomes a point of contention. Who makes what decisions? Does the executive director, CEO, leader make some, and then others get delegated? What's the decision-making process between the board and the CEO or executive director or whomever the stakeholders are? There's a value there that needs to be agreed upon. How is the voice of our youth included? It's a huge one. And going back to the first, it's great to hear youth perspective and voices, but how are we hearing it? Are we just taking it to say this is evidence of our success in appropriating the voices? Or are we listening deeply and allowing them to become a part of the decision-making process? What decisions do they get to make? That's a part of values. And I'm not saying choose one way or the other. I'm just saying these are questions that need to be asked. How do we talk about race? I'm not going to let it go. Do we just avoid the conversation? And you might say, oh, we're pretty racially homogenous. We don't need to talk about it. Still got to talk. And you got to find a way to talk about it. And your choice not to says something about what you value. Values. Start there. Articulate them clearly.